Well, thank you, Rich, for the very kind introduction and the walk down memory lane. Thank you all for the warm welcome. It's great to be back with the National Review Institute. I was invited today to speak about what a conservative foreign policy ought to look like. When you ask what a conservative this or that is, it raises a more basic question. What are we conserving? I usually look at our founding to answer that question, in this case to our Constitution. The preamble says that we established our government to, among other things, secure the blessings of liberty. What are those blessings of liberty? Simply enough, I would suggest they are our safety, freedom, and prosperity. So how do we conserve those things? Well, that's the key question, but it's not one that we can answer in the abstract, nor should we try to. Conservatives, after all, should avoid abstractions in favor of concrete, tangible reality. Foreign policy, especially a conservative foreign policy, is foremost the realm of prudential judgment and reasoning. In every case, there's 101 different considerations to take into account. Foreign policy is emphatically not the province of doctrines. It's hard to imagine something less conservative than a doctrine applicable to every foreign policy issue we may face. Even the most famous doctrine of all, the Monroe Doctrine, authored by the great John Quincy Adams, applied specifically and concretely to the threat posed by reactionary European monarchies attempting to recolonize independent nations in our hemisphere. While the doctrine is still highly relevant today and suggests a series of policies to address new circumstances, especially China's meddling in Latin America, it didn't purport to guide America's foreign policy regarding, say, North Africa or East Asia. So let us discard the search for grand and abstract doctrines. It's an idle and fruitless endeavor, usually indulged by professors and journalists who don't know better. Sorry, no offense. Of course, prudential reasoning doesn't mean unprincipled reasoning. The exact opposite, actually. We always get back to that basic principle of securing the blessings of liberty. The question itself is the principled guide in each practical case. What course of action will keep America safe? What will preserve our freedom? What will promote widespread, durable prosperity? I believe these are the questions that our greatest conservative statesmen have always asked and oriented their foreign policy around. Men like George Washington, John Quincy Adams, and Ronald Reagan. Their answers, of course, seem to be very different on the surface. But this is exactly my point about prudential reasoning in foreign policy. Circumstances matter a lot. Let me give you an example. Some like to cite as a guide today Washington's farewell address, with its warning against permanent alliances and recommendation for as little political connection as possible with other nations. That address was a great pronouncement by a great statesman. But it addressed very specific circumstances in 1796. A young, weak, and fragile America. A Europe convulsed by the French Revolution. And fairly primitive military and communications technology, at least by today's standards. If he were with us today, Washington wouldn't excuse lazy, sloppy thinking that takes his concrete policy recommendations then and simply grafts them onto today's world. The farewell address itself is seeded with suggestions to the contrary. Washington referred to our detached and distant situation, and he lauded the advantages of so peculiar a situation, and rightly so in 1796. But does anyone really think that such a practical, hard-nosed statesman as Washington would assess our situation the same today? I very much doubt it. That's why his farewell address should still guide us today, though not in any kind of automatic or reflexive way. The farewell address also carries a significant element of time. As he put it, the period is not far off when America would stand up, gather strength, and have freedom of action in the world. This point is important, so I think it's worth quoting at length. With me, Washington explained, a predominant motive has been to endeavor to gain time to our country to settle and mature its yet recent institutions and to progress without interruption to that degree of strength and consistency which is necessary to give it, humanly speaking, the command of its own fortunes. In other words, Washington foresaw a time when our policy might change, probably should change, based on changed circumstances. A good example, which again gets back to my point about prudential reasoning, came a quarter century later with John Quincy Adams and the Monroe Doctrine. In Washington's time, we probably lacked the strength to pursue such a policy, even had it been needed. But by Washington's presidency, by Monroe's presidency, circumstances had changed. We had gained enough strength to implement a new policy that was needed, given the currents of European politics. Or to say the same thing differently, we had reached enough of a modus vivendi with Great Britain after the War of 1812 that we could rely on its naval power and its aligned interests with us against continental Europe to help enforce the Monroe Doctrine. It was a masterstroke of clear-eyed diplomacy. I have to say, by the way, that I am surprised that some people invoke John Quincy Adams as a patron saint of a restrained and passive foreign policy. I suspect he would be too. For the 12 years he was at the helm, first as Secretary of State and then as President, America had an activist foreign policy, as one would expect from such a brilliant strategist. When it comes to foreign policy, to borrow from the legendary Bill Rood, you run the show where the show runs you. Even with America still young and relatively weak, Adams was all about running the show. So was Reagan, another brilliant strategist. Despite our reverence for the great man, I have to say, I still think we don't fully appreciate his greatness at times. For many years, Soviet Russia had run the show, putting America and the forces of freedom on the back foot. Reagan seized the initiative back from the Russians so completely and ran the show so effectively that the Soviet Union disintegrated barely a decade later. Now, on a certain level, Reagan's foreign policy seems to break sharply with Washington and Adams. We had allies all around the rimland of Europe, Eurasia, I should say, bound by treaty and honor to go to war with them. We went abroad and destroyed monsters in far-flung corners of the globe. Everywhere you turn, Reagan confronted and challenged our enemies again and again. But at a deeper level, Reagan had the same foreign policy as Washington and Adams, all things considered. As I've stressed, they must be. He surveyed the world and acted to secure the blessings of liberty for America. We faced a committed, old world power with a fanatical globalist ideology grafted on top of it. Military and communications technology had advanced to the point that we couldn't expect time to gather our strength and rally our allies when the war began. In fact, thanks to the rise of global precision strike weapons, we might not even realize the war had begun. Under these circumstances, Reagan did exactly what I believe Washington and Adams would have done. He rebuilt our military strength from its shocking lows of the 1970s. As Washington suggested, military strength is always preferable to military weakness. Only the strong can survive in a dangerous world. Only the strong can preserve their freedom. And for that matter, only the strong can protect the weak, and only the strong can afford to be merciful. Reagan understood that in modern times, America depends on beachheads and lodgements of freedom around the world to protect ourselves right here at home. Reagan was not blind to our allies' shortcomings. Still, he understood, as Churchill said, the only thing worse than fighting a war with allies is fighting without them. And Reagan also supported the forces of freedom around the world to pressure Soviet Russia, which tried to undermine them around the world. Whether a friendly government facing a communist insurgency or freedom fighters resisting a communist government, Reagan never confused America's friends with our enemies, nor drew a moral equivalence between the two. But Reagan also never confused means with ends. Reagan oriented his policy based on America's interests, on the need to protect our safety, our freedom, and our prosperity. For example, he supported solidarity in the Contras, not for their sake, but for ours. Yes, he admired them and he wanted Poland and Nicaragua to live in freedom, but his prime motive was always America's freedom. Reagan destroyed plenty of monsters in places like Grenada in the Middle East, but he did so to protect America. All of these actions were, to borrow again from the farewell address, in our interest, guided by justice. And I would add, if you don't think John Quincy Adams would have invaded Grenada under these circumstances, you don't know much about John Quincy Adams. A conservative foreign policy based on our interests, guided by justice, is a good contrast to conservative and liberal foreign policy, on which I can end. Conservatives from Washington to today have never been ashamed of acting on our interests. Who will if we don't? But liberals from Woodrow Wilson to Joe Biden think there's something embarrassing or unseemly about acting in our interests. Just 3 days after Germany killed 128 Americans by sinking the Lusitania, Wilson gave what's known as, incredibly, the too proud to fight speech. He admonished us not to think just of America first, but also of humanity first. More amazing still, he warned our nation not to have what he called the narrowness and prejudice of a family, which is less interested in the neighbors than it is in its own members. Think about how radical that metaphor is. I bet you probably care more about your family and its members than you care about your neighbor, even if you're a good neighbor. That's okay because the neighbors do too. But, according to Wilson, Americans shouldn't care more about our nation than we care for other nations. That would just be narrowness and prejudice. When Wilson finally declared war 2 years later, he made clear in his war message to Congress that America was fighting on behalf of abstractions in other nations, not, for instance, to protect American lives and shipping from unrestricted submarine warfare or to defend our southern border from invasion. Wilson famously declared that the world must be made safe for democracy. But there's one word missing there, and it gets to the heart of the difference between liberal and conservative foreign policy. I would say that the world must be made safe for America's democracy. I suspect George Washington, John Quincy Adams, and Ronald Reagan probably would have agreed. And while it's not always easy or clear in any given case under the circumstances to know just how to protect our democracy, to secure the blessings of liberty, it remains the lodestar of conservative foreign policy. I'll be happy to discuss any of those particular cases with Rich during our conversation, but for now, I want to thank the National Review Institute for all it has done over the years to secure the blessings of liberty. Thank you. God bless you. God bless the United States.
Thank you, Senator. That was tremendous. So let me start just with where public opinion is among conservatives and our friends at the moment. You're out there a lot, sort of taking what Lincoln called public opinion baths. Where are most conservatives on the question of Ukraine and Russia?
The American people, conservatives very much included, deeply oppose invasions and naked wars of aggression. That very much goes for Russia's naked war of aggression against Ukraine. The other main instance of that in my lifetime was when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. You saw similar public opinion, but the antipathy towards Russia runs very deep in the American political mind, especially
just given the history,
especially in the conservative mind. And the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 didn't really change that. And when you see this kind of war of aggression waged by a brutal dictator in which women and children are being slaughtered, then the American people, but especially conservatives, feel very strongly. And that's borne out not just in anecdotal public opinion baths across the state of Arkansas, or that my colleagues take in their states as well, but in public opinion polling as well, that Vladimir Putin and Russia are about as popular as syphilis these days. And for that matter, Joe Biden gets relatively low marks in his conduct of America's policy regarding this war so far, overwhelmingly because Americans think he is not doing enough. And again, those are polls of the American people at large, not polls of partisan Republicans. And the American people are right, by the way.
So it strikes me that the folks on the right call themselves realists or restrainers or new isolationists or whatever they are, partly misinterpret the Trump phenomenon. Obviously, a major break with where George W. Bush was on foreign policy, but not an isolationist, right? It was a more Jacksonian-oriented foreign policy rather than arguably a Wilsonian one under Bush. We can get into that a little bit more in a minute. But it wasn't, he did bomb the S out of ISIS just the way he promised. He pasted Soleimani when he had the opportunity, and his reflex obviously was to pull out of Afghanistan, but he never did it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would say that George W. Bush's foreign policy was a mixture of Jacksonian and Wilsonian impulses. More Jacksonian, the immediate aftermath of 9/11. It changed over time to be a bit more Wilsonian. You got to the second inaugural where President Bush declared that our goal was to end tyranny in the world, which is a very noble goal, but it probably is beyond the capacity of our nation and perhaps will be beyond the capacity of any nation for as long as mankind lives. But the Trump policy, as you say, was much more Jacksonian. Trump, like Reagan, not to the same degree as Reagan, used the friends of freedom around the world to help advance our own interests. Doesn't mean that we don't stand in solidarity with Hong Kongers who have had their freedom crushed, or certainly religious and ethnic minorities in China who are facing genocide. But we also know, just like Reagan did from Soviet dissidents or Polish solidarity, that it is a deep source of weakness and insecurity in Beijing. And therefore we should push on it, because Beijing is our enemy in the same way that Moscow was our enemy back in the day. Russia has chosen to make not just Ukraine, but the Western world its enemy in 101 different ways. Those are very different threats, and they require very different actions. But we did nothing since 1991 that provoked Russia or Vladimir Putin into taking this action. I mean, he laid it all out well in advance of the invasion in a long essay last summer, which he basically just turned into a speech on the eve of the invasion, that he views Ukraine as a phony country that belongs to Russia and always has, going back centuries, and that he was going to restore it. And nothing America has done or refrained from doing provoked Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine. I think most normal Americans know that. And again, like Americans strongly oppose invasions. They view them very differently than they view, say, civil wars in other nations.
So what would you make of the argument, again, from the other side on the right, and then also you'd hear from the left? All right, so let's say you're right about Vladimir Putin and whatnot, but we're still correct to have a real skeptical eye to what anyone says who's on the hawkish part of the spectrum, because Iraq didn't turn out the way you promised. Afghanistan, we were in it for 20 years, and as soon as we pull out, the army collapses. And obviously, you know, to your great credit, you're at the pointy end of the spear in Iraq. You were not advocating for it or voting for it in Congress at the time, but these should be discrediting events for hawks going forward.
Well, I think it's too easy oftentimes to just divide camps into hawks and doves. In many cases, foreign policy is full of ostriches as well. People that in both parties just want to stick their head in the sand and ignore problems. You also have to accept the world as you find it. You know, this is a point that Bob Gates, another great conservative statesman, has made. You know, he came in very late 2006. He was not part of the decision to invade Afghanistan or invade Iraq or the early days of that, but he accepted the problems and the challenges he faced, and for instance, supported the surge in Iraq and supported the surge in Afghanistan to try to make a difference, as he writes about extensively in his memoirs. We made a lot of mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan over the years as we shifted the objectives and became more kind of Wilsonian, to use the word you chose earlier, to try to establish, you know, Western parliamentary style democracies in countries where the soil for that kind of government had not been very fertile for many years. But those twists and turns that we took over the years, the mistakes that first President Bush made, later corrected, especially in Iraq, and that President Obama made repeatedly without ever correcting, is a lot of the kind of what caused the American people to be disappointed with the outcome and the trajectory of that war. You saw again last year, though, there's a big difference between ending a war and losing a war, and the American people were very dissatisfied with the way we ended up losing Kabul at the end.
So there's some people who've very skeptical of any level of aid to Ukraine whatsoever, who have been out there saying, I feel that the 2003 mood is gripping the country again, which is completely ridiculous, because the 2003 mood was directly connected to the 2001 mood, where if you were in Midtown Manhattan for months afterwards, after those attacks, you had the stench of 2 dead buildings in your nostrils, you know, every single day. And that obviously, that's why we invaded Afghanistan, was also a crucial predicate for Iraq, which wouldn't have happened in the absence of that attack, I believe.
Yeah, I just don't see that mood around the country, and I really don't see it that much in Congress. I think one of the lessons of our failures to deter this invasion in 2021 and early 2022 is a lesson that President Biden should have taken from Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, is that standing with our friends, helping them defend themselves, being clear and competent in the use of American power in all of its many tools and instruments does not lead to war, it leads to success. And you saw that time and time again with Ronald Reagan. Sometimes it was military action, such as the invasion of Grenada, which was an absolutely necessary and righteous war. Sometimes you saw it through arming other peoples, like we armed the Afghans to fight back against the Soviets. So there's a lot of different ways we can use American power, and this is an old kind of false choice that Barack Obama specialized in, and his acolytes in the administration are still doing this, that in every place we face a challenge, it's either some kind of humiliating concessions, or it's outright war with 100,000 heavy mechanized troops rolling across a foreign country's border. That's just not the case. It wasn't the case under Reagan. It wasn't the case under Trump either.
Yeah, I mean,
as you said, who did not blink from defending America's interests.
Yeah, if you have a guerrilla force or a national army that's willing to carry forward the fight against your enemies, and you don't have to be directly involved, and you just have to arm and support them, it seems...
Yeah, and there's, you know, I mentioned about doctrines in my speech. You know, there was, some people talked about a Reagan doctrine in arming those kind of insurgencies. I don't think Reagan ever actually used the term himself. I think, again, it was the construct of journalists and academics who always want to frame things in those terms. But he acted prudentially as the cases bore out. Same way, you know, I mentioned about invasions. I mean, our reaction to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait is different right now than our reaction to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, even though you saw kind of equivalent levels of revulsion. Well, the circumstances are very different in those countries as well. You know, in 1990, our prosperity still depended very much on the flow of oil and gas from the Persian Gulf, which is not the case today from Ukraine. And Saddam Hussein had the world's fourth largest army, but he didn't have nuclear weapons. He certainly didn't have a nuclear arsenal in the thousands. So in each of these cases, you know, you have to revert to prudential reasoning about the circumstances, but the guiding principle should always be, how do we secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves at home? And I think that gets back to the distinction I made about how the American people feel about invasions versus civil wars, is they kind of intuitively understand that having aggressive dictators believe they can wantonly invade other countries and reshape the political map around the world is ultimately more threatening to our safety at home than having civil wars in this, that, or the other country. And they're right about that.
So should our goal just be flat out to defeat Vladimir Putin in Ukraine?
I mean, President Zelensky has stated a very reasonable goal, which is that he'd like to get invading troops off of his soil. It's a very reasonable goal. We should help President Zelensky and the Ukrainian army achieve that goal. We shouldn't try to help them achieve something more than that. You know, we don't want them invading and marching on Moscow, but we should stand with them as long as that remains their goal and back them to the hilt. I do worry that over time, the Biden administration, especially if pressured by certain European countries, may begin to condition the provision of arms or diplomatic and political support for Ukraine on President Zelensky being willing to cut a bad deal, which I don't think we should force upon them. President Biden also has a very bad habit of speaking loosely and freely in a way that is contrary to our interests. You know, early on, before the invasion, he said, well, if it's a minor incursion, maybe it won't prompt a response from NATO. You know, famously or infamously in Warsaw at the end of March, he said that Vladimir Putin needs to be removed from power. Look, Ronald Reagan was very tough on Soviet Russia. He confronted them everywhere, as I said in my remarks. I don't believe he ever called for the ouster of Brezhnev or Andropov or Gorbachev. Right.
Yeah, they need to get that Easter Bunny at more Biden events, waving him off. Do you have any level of fear that if Putin is looking at a frank defeat that is humiliating and potentially, you know, would represent the history of Russian rulers that have lost wars is not a happy one? Maybe he could, you know, get around it because he has almost total control of the information space in Russia. But any fear that that would push him too far, push him to escalate in a way that would be much more dangerous than what's happening now and potentially draw on NATO?
I am mindful. I'm not fearful. Vladimir Putin should be fearful of what Ukraine and its allies are going to do to his army. Again, I think one real shortcoming for President Biden and some European leaders in late 2021 and early 2022 was to keep saying what we wouldn't do or what we were afraid of, as opposed to making Vladimir Putin worry about what we would do. And especially that's the case after the first 2 or 3 weeks of the war, when it became clear that his lightning strike for Kyiv to topple the government was going to fail. He is the one that should be especially fearful of what will happen in Ukraine if he doesn't find some way to get an off-ramp and withdraw from that country. I mean, it reminds me of a story about U.S. Grant after he showed up down the street at Willard in the early spring of 1864 and took command of all Union armies, and he dealt with all these generals from the Army of the Potomac who were dealing with Stockholm Syndrome, having been beaten by Lee up and down the eastern seaboard for 2 years. And he told them that I'm heartily tired of hearing what Robert E. Lee is going to do to us. You all seem to think that he will do a backflip and a somersault and land on both of our flanks and our rear at the same time. Why don't you go back to your commands and decide what you are going to do to Robert E. Lee? And that should be the mindset that the President has and that our NATO allies have.
This is a great story of him showing up at the Willard here down the street in his shabby uniform with his rucksack, and they wanted to give him the worst room in the hotel until they said, oh, it's U.S. Grant. And then he goes over to the reception and has to stand on the sofa so everyone can see him and hear from the great man. Truly one of the most inspiring figures in American history. So we got Russia, obviously, and then we have this major threat growing from China. How do we balance those two? Is there any zero-sum aspect to how would we prepare to deal with China versus vis-a-vis how we deal with containing Russia?
Well, I think it's important to remember they're very different kinds of threat, and China is a much graver threat. Russia is a declining power and has been for a long time. And its economy is barely two-thirds the size of Italy's. And Italy is not exactly going gangbusters, if you notice lately. It was never terribly integrated into the world economy. Now it's even less so. And its military, despite major investments over the last 15 years, has proven incapable of defeating the Ukrainian military, much less NATO's combined forces. So although that's the most urgent issue we face today, we cannot lose sight of the fact that China is very different and a much graver threat. China's economy is almost as large as ours. It is deeply integrated with the world economy, and especially our economy. That has a distorting effect on our domestic politics. There's a massive China lobby all across the country, in every state, every congressional district, advocating for conciliation with China. Its military is rapidly expanding, both its conventional forces and its nuclear forces. So we can't lose sight of the fact that China poses a genuine threat to replace America as the dominant power in the world, even if the war in Ukraine is the most pressing issue right now. Fortunately, a lot of what we would do to deter Russia, we would do to deter China as well. Most basically, that includes reinvesting in our military and building it back up, so it's not reaching the point where we reached in the late 1970s. With the kind of systems that are of great practical utility everywhere. You know, the new stealth bomber, mass production of the F-35 stealth fighter, a large naval buildup to include a mix of surface and subsea manned combatants and unmanned combatants as well. Our nuclear modernization to include recapitalizing the entire triad or intercontinental missiles, that bomber and the cruise missiles it will carry, and SSBN submarines that carry the ballistic missiles, but also other kinds of nuclear weapons that the Trump administration has proposed. The Biden administration has kept some, cut others, all designed to offset the 10-to-1 advantage that Russia has against us and that China may soon have against us. Those are the basic elements we can take to meet the challenge of both. With China, it'll take a lot more. It'll take more economic reform as well to help decouple strategic parts of our economy from China, so we are not funding their rise as we have for 30 years. It will require more political and diplomatic commitments, for instance, to Taiwan, and to rally and marshal ally support for Taiwan in the Western Pacific. That should be taking the lion's share of kind of the long-term strategic thinking of this administration.
So let's go back to nukes for a minute, because this is one of these areas where we've had this bizarre thinking that if we do things that make sense for our self-defense, it'll be provocative to people who are already, Russia's going way up in tactical nukes, and China's been involved in this enormous buildup and hasn't been a party to any of these arms control agreements we've had with Russia.
Jimmy Carter, nobody's idea of a strong president, had a Secretary of Defense who acknowledged this. He said, when we build, they build, and when we stop building, they build. Our actions to defend our country are largely immaterial to countries like Russia and China. They can put pressure on them the way we put pressure in the 1980s, but it's just manifestly clear if you look at the history of arms control agreements, which are largely failures with Soviet Russia, and you look at Soviet-Russian reaction to American foreign policy in the mid-1970s to the late 1970s, and how aggressive they were around the globe versus how they behaved under Reagan's administration, that the best way to counteract them is to put pressure on them and to use our economic strength turned into military might, to use our system of alliances around the world and our support for other beleaguered nations who might have aligned interests to counteract them. The idea that if we just unilaterally decide to disarm, as Bernie Sanders would do with our missiles, he would defund our entire modernization of our intercontinental missiles, which are 50 years old, And he wouldn't just save the money, he'd give it to Tony Fauci and the CDC. And the name of the bill with which he'd do that is the Investing in Cures Before Missiles Act, the ICBM.
That's clever.
You can't even make it
clever,
up.
Yeah.
But Russia and especially China would simply pocket those gains and laugh at us and continue to add hundreds of more missile silos in Western China as they're doing right now.
So speaking of laughing at us, let's talk a little bit more about decoupling and the defense industrial base. One thing you focused on, among many others in this area, is rare earths, where I'm going to get the details wrong, but in broad strokes, this is what happened. General Electric had a rare earth concern. It sells it to a Chinese or partly owned Chinese company. All of it's sucked over there. They're happy to have it. I'm sure they subsidize it. We have one rare earth mine in the entire United States. We don't produce any rare earth. It's in California, and I thought this was kind of interesting. At least there's one left, and it's in California. So I wanted one of our writers to go there and do a big on-the-scene report. And the word came back, Rich, actually that rare earth mine is partly owned by China, and they don't want National Review showing up there or writing about it. But rare earths are extremely important to a modern economy and to our weapons, among other things.
Yeah, very, very important to both the economy and our defense. Ironically, they're not terribly rare at all. You might be able to go up and down the mall and dig some up. What is rare is the actual mining of them, which we really don't do in America, except for that one mine out in California, and certainly the processing and the refining of them, which is done predominantly in China today. And that's the kind of thing of which we need to be mindful. China cut off Japan from rare earths in 2010 in a dispute over the Senkaku Islands temporarily. So there's always that threat hanging over America and other countries. But also it can just be a matter of supply chain. And the more demand for these elements in China, the more likely those companies in China processing them are going to sell first to those companies in China, the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party, as opposed to sell to our automobile manufacturers or other industries. So it's an example of something that's very urgent, that we develop diversified alternative supply chains, from getting it out of the ground to processing it into final product ready to ship to OEMs. It's not going to happen overnight, but it needs to start now. And this kind of thing that we can no longer be dependent upon China for.
How about semiconductors?
We aren't terribly dependent on China for semiconductors. Unfortunately, the most advanced semiconductors in the world are made on an island that's 100 miles from mainland China, against which it has longstanding irredentist claims. So that's just another reason why we should make it very clear to China that we will not tolerate the invasion of Taiwan, which will happen. China will invade Taiwan.
Invade?
China will invade Taiwan if America doesn't take steps now to deter it. Partly that means arming Taiwan faster and more effectively than we have. It means working with their Ministry of Defense to reform their military, especially their reserve and mobilization practices. And it means adopting what's called strategic clarity, just stating outright to Beijing, we will come to Taiwan's aid. Our policy for 40 years has been strategic ambiguity. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. Circumstances, again, have changed a lot. Ambiguity served us once. Clarity would serve us now. If we don't take those steps, China will invade Taiwan, certainly in the next 5 years in Xi Jinping's third term, maybe much sooner than that. In the meantime, while we're doing all that, we should do as much as we can to get TSMC to start building semiconductor fabs, hopefully in America, but also outside of missile range of mainland China.
So do you get the sense that Taiwan is taking this threat seriously enough? Because when I've delved into this area, it's kind of shocking that they seem to be buying the wrong sort of stuff, and their preparedness is not at a very high level, which, if you're Germany, and maybe the Germans have finally gotten religion on this, it's understandably or cosseted within the Western alliance. Russia's going to have to go through a number of countries before it gets to you, and it's not coming to you anyway. But that's not true of Taiwan. Do the Taiwanese take this with the requisite seriousness?
So I think a lot of their elected leaders do. I think Tsai Ing-wen does. Some of their national security bureaucracy, not quite. You're right that they don't always focus on the most effective tools to deter a Chinese invasion or to defeat it should it happen. There used to be a saying in American politics, a chicken in every pot. Well, in Taiwan, they should probably have a stinger in every garage ready for the Chinese invasion. Likewise, they need more anti-ship missiles or more advanced smart mines for the invading force. As I said, they need a stronger reserve system. They need the kind of reserve system that small countries next to hostile neighbors like Israel and Finland have, as opposed to focusing more on their standing army. These are steps that they need to take. They've needed to take them for a while. I hope the invasion of Ukraine shows them the urgency of taking them. I mean, in some ways, China's operation to invade Taiwan would be harder because of the stopping power of water. But by the same token, it would be much harder for us to arm Taiwan after an invasion than it is in Ukraine, because China can impose a naval and aerial embargo on Taiwan.
And are we in a position to defend Guam at the moment?
Yes, although we could be in a better position to defend it. And we need to make it clear that we treat Guam in the same way we treat the continental United States. We need to make that clear to Beijing.
So we just have a couple minutes left. There's multi-layered threats, and one of them is from within, ideological threat to this country's standing and to just common sense and training in the military, which is DEI, which the military spends an inordinate amount of time on, arguably to the exclusion of really important things like knowing how to put a fire out on a ship. How do we combat this?
Well, we've had some initiatives in the Congress. I think we're going to have more next year when we take back the majorities. But we need a new Republican president, Secretary of Defense, that just puts an end to it.
And that you can just do that just by edict. You're not doing
the new Secretary of Defense he can just write his own little PowerPoint page. The Armed Forces of the United States are an equal opportunity employer, and we have a zero tolerance policy for any kind of harassment based on race or ethnicity or sex or religion or anything else. That's basically what it was when I was in the Army. And we all knew what EO was. We all knew what EO training was, and we got refresher training on it periodically.
And it was an institution that was a model in this.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the Army has an extremely distinguished record. I mean, the military as a whole, Army just the biggest part of it, and the oldest part of it, has an extremely distinguished record of racial progress. The Army was integrated shortly after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball. African Americans serve in the military in higher proportions than they're present in the population as a whole, and especially at some of the higher ranks of the non-commissioned officer corps, which is the backbone of our military. Not exactly an institution that's racked by systemic racism. And we need civilian leaders, the President, Secretary of Defense, service secretaries as well, who make that clear, that we expect soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines to spend the vast bulk of their time learning their craft, honing their skills, and preparing to fight and win a war.
So, final question, we'll conclude here. So, are you optimistic about the long-term prospects of the United States, and why?
I am very optimistic about the long-term prospects because of the dynamism of our people and the nature of our system. Some people might say that our system is true because it works. I'd say it works because it's true. It's a system of government that's built on the unchanging nature of man, and it reflects the ability to seize what is best in the human soul and to elevate it and to help people capitalize on it, as opposed to what you see in governments like China and Russia. Does it mean it's inevitable? No, it's not. I mean, to go back to our contrast between conservatives and liberals, we don't believe in history with capital H. There is no arc to history. There is no wrong or right side of history in the sense that it's predetermined as opposed to made by men and women at critical times. And I think we have a lot of reasons to be optimistic, but those are not foreordained. They're not inevitable. Ultimately, American decline would be a choice made by and imposed on us by liberals. But that's why it's so imperative that we as conservatives stand up, make the case, win elections, and govern effectively.
Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Cotton. Great job. Thank you.